The night of the 17th of February 1943 is bitterly cold across the Tunisian plateau, and the German armoured crews of the 10th Panzer Division have settled into a routine that feels, by now, almost comfortable. Their tanks, Panzer III and IV models, the workhorses of the Wehrmacht's armoured fist, sit in dispersed formation across the scrubland west of Kasserine. Engines cold, hatches shut against the desert night that drops to temperatures well below freezing. The crews sleep in their vehicles or in shallow dugouts nearby, trusting in sentries, in darkness, and in the 40 miles of contested ground between themselves and the nearest British positions. Nobody expects trouble before dawn. Nobody watches the sky to the north with particular vigilance. And so nobody notices at first the faint drone of a single de Havilland Mosquito crossing the ridgeline at 9,000 feet, flying without lights, its twin Merlin engines throttled back to their quietest register. The aircraft carries no bombs in the conventional sense. Its bomb bay holds instead a collection of small metal canisters, each one roughly the size of a thermos flask, packed with a substance that the men who developed it referred to, with characteristic British understatement, as a special fluid. The Mosquito's navigator checks his coordinates against the terrain below, cross-references the map reference that arrived by signal 3 days ago, and nods to the pilot. The aircraft banks gently, descends to 4,000 feet, and at a precise moment over the dispersed tank formation below, releases its unusual payload. The canisters tumble silently in the darkness. They are fitted with small wind vane fuses that arm them after a set number of rotations in freefall. They land scattered across an area of perhaps 800 square meters, some striking tank hulls with a soft metallic tap, others settling into the dust beside track links, engine grills, and the gap between turret and hull ring. The Mosquito climbs away to the north and is gone within 4 minutes of releasing its load. Nothing explodes, nothing burns. The sentries hear nothing unusual. The faint tapping of the canister's landing is swallowed by the wind. By midnight, the temperature has dropped to 4 degrees Celsius. By 3 in the morning, it has fallen further still, and the special fluid, now seeping slowly from its ruptured canisters into every crack and gap it can find, is doing precisely what its designers intended. At dawn, when the 10th Panzer's crews received orders to move in response to Allied activity near Thala, 12 of their tanks simply would not start. Not because of mechanical failure in any conventional sense. Not because of battle damage, because their engines had, overnight, been rendered effectively inoperative by a substance that had worked its way into lubrication systems, fuel lines, and cooling circuits, and there degraded, polymerized, and thickened into a compound with the consistency of cold treacle. 3 of the affected vehicles required engine replacements. 2 were eventually abandoned during the subsequent Allied advance. The other 7 were eventually returned to service, but not before consuming maintenance hours, replacement parts, and, most critically, time that the Wehrmacht could not afford during a campaign already stretched to its operational limits. This was Operation Cauldron, one of several dozen successful deployments of what the Special Operations Executive and the Royal Air Force collectively referred to as engine-gumming compounds, a weapon so unglamorous, so devoid of the explosive drama associated with conventional ordnance that it has been almost entirely absent from popular histories of the Second World War. It was not a weapon that produced spectacular reconnaissance photographs. It did not level cities or sink ships. It did not produce the visceral imagery that filled newsreels and newspapers. It worked slowly, quietly, and chemically in the dark, and its effects were frustratingly difficult to measure with precision. And yet the men who understood logistics, who understood that a Panzer IV immobilized for 72 hours in a maintenance depot is just as useless as a Panzer IV destroyed by an anti-tank round, recognized it as something genuinely significant, a weapon designed not to destroy, but to corrode, not to kill, but to consume time. The strategic problem it addressed was, by 1941, becoming acute. German armoured forces operated on an enormous logistical tail. A single panzer division at full establishment required roughly 300 tons of fuel, ammunition, and spare parts per day of active operations. The tank itself, whether a Panzer III with its 300 horsepower Maybach HL-120 engine or the heavier Panzer IV, demanded constant maintenance. The Maybach engines were sophisticated, relatively temperamental pieces of engineering that required clean oil, regular servicing, and above all the correct lubricating fluids maintained at the correct viscosity. In the extremes of the Eastern Front, North Africa, and later the Italian campaign, maintaining these conditions was already difficult. German quartermasters and workshop companies performed something close to miracles simply keeping their vehicles mobile. The mathematics of armoured maintenance were, in fact, brutal. In the opening months of Barbarossa, mechanical breakdown accounted for more panzer losses than Soviet anti-tank fire. The average operational availability rate for German armoured units, the percentage of tanks on strength that were actually fit for immediate action, hovered between 55 and 70%, depending on the formation and the intensity of recent operations. Every disruption to the maintenance cycle had cascading effects. The British recognized this vulnerability long before they had a practical means of exploiting it. The challenge was delivery. Bombing tank parks was wildly inefficient. Dispersal and camouflage made precise strikes nearly impossible, and the blast-resistant nature of armored vehicles meant that even near misses rarely caused critical damage. Partisan sabotage was effective where resistance networks were strong, but across the vast spaces of Russia or the open desert of North Africa, partisan activity was either impossible or too dangerous to the local population to be consistently relied upon. What was needed was something that could be delivered from the air, in small quantities, with minimal aircraft risk, and that would produce effects hours or days after delivery, long enough that the connection between cause and effect would not be immediately obvious to German mechanics. The solution emerged from an unlikely collaboration between the research chemists of the Special Operations Executive and the petroleum engineers of Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, working in a converted laboratory in a country house outside Aylesbury. The core concept was deceptively simple. If you could introduce a substance into an engine's lubrication or fuel system that appeared initially to be benign, but that gradually degraded under heat and pressure into compounds that would gum up, thicken or abrade the engine's internal components, you could produce engine failure that would look, to a field mechanic, like ordinary mechanical breakdown. The vehicle would be taken out of service for inspection and repair, workshops would be occupied, spare parts would be consumed, and, most importantly, no one would necessarily connect the failure to enemy action at all. The chief chemist driving this development was a quietly spoken Welshman named Dr. Glyn Thomas, a petroleum chemist who had spent the pre-war years working on lubricant formulations for industrial machinery. Thomas was not a dramatic figure in any conventional sense. He was, by all accounts, more comfortable with a gas chromatograph than with the cloak and dagger atmosphere of SOE's Baker Street headquarters. But he possessed an unusually precise understanding of the chemistry of lubricant degradation, and he understood intuitively what the operational requirements demanded. The compound needed to be stable at ambient temperatures. It had to survive being stored, transported, loaded into aircraft, and dropped from altitude without prematurely activating. It needed to pass through the fine filters used in German engine lubrication systems without being caught. It needed to produce its effects gradually enough that the initial introduction would not be detected during pre-operation checks, but rapidly enough under operating temperatures that the damage would manifest within 1 to 3 hours of the engine being run. And it needed to produce failure modes that would convincingly mimic ordinary mechanical wear. What Thomas and his team eventually produced, after 18 months of development, numerous failed formulations, and at least 2 laboratory incidents that are described in the surviving records with the characteristic SOE phrase, minor difficulties, was a family of compounds based on long-chain polymer precursors suspended in a carrier fluid with a viscosity close to that of diesel fuel or standard engine oil. At temperatures below 15 degrees Celsius, the compound remained stable and relatively fluid. Above 40 degrees, the temperature reached within a running engine, the polymer chains began to cross-link rapidly, producing a semi-solid mass with far higher viscosity than the lubricant it had contaminated. In practical terms, this meant that an engine running normally would, within 60 to 90 minutes of startup, begin to experience elevated oil temperatures, increased bearing friction, and eventually seizure of components whose lubrication had been compromised. The progression was gradual enough to defeat casual inspection, but certain enough, once the process had begun, to be irreversible without a complete oil drain, flush, and, in serious cases, component replacement. The production of these compounds presented its own challenges. The precursor chemicals were not obscure or exotic. Several had legitimate industrial uses, but manufacturing them in sufficient purity and in the quantities required for operational use demanded proper industrial facilities. The actual production was eventually contracted to a small chemical works in Huddersfield that had been manufacturing industrial solvents before the war, with the entire operation classified at the highest level. Workers knew they were producing something for the war effort. They did not know what. The facility operated under the cover designation of producing specialized hydraulic testing fluids, which was, in a sense, not entirely inaccurate. The delivery mechanism evolved considerably over the course of the weapon's operational life. The earliest field deployments, in 1941 and early 1942, relied on agents inserting the compound directly into vehicle fuel or oil systems by hand, a method that was effective when it worked, but that required agents to get close enough to German vehicles to be acutely dangerous. The SOE's circuits in France and Belgium reported a number of incidents in which agents were caught or killed attempting vehicle sabotage of this kind. The shift to aerial delivery, dropping the compound in small ruptured canisters designed to split on impact and release their contents over a targeted area, came from a suggestion by a young RAF officer named Flight Lieutenant Marcus Webb, who had previously worked in agricultural aviation and who understood how liquid dispersal from altitude could be used to treat large areas efficiently. Webb's proposal was initially met with skepticism. The concern was that the canisters would scatter too widely, reducing the concentration of compound per vehicle to ineffective levels, and that wind would further displace the material unpredictably. Webb's counter-argument that even partial contamination of a proportion of vehicles in a target park would generate sufficient maintenance disruption to justify the mission eventually prevailed. The aerial canister, as it was refined through 1942, was a remarkably simple device. It consisted of a thin-walled aluminium cylinder approximately 9 inches long and 2.5 inches in diameter, filled with approximately 340 milliliters of the gumming compound. A small wind vane assembly on the tail armed the fuse after roughly 800 rotations in freefall, calculated to represent a drop from between 3,000 and 8,000 feet, which covered the range of altitudes from which they would typically be released. On impact, a scored ring around the cylinder's midsection allowed the casing to split cleanly, releasing the compound in a controlled splash pattern with a radius of roughly 18 inches. Early tests at the Porton Down experimental establishment, conducted using captured German vehicles, demonstrated that a single canister landing within 2 feet of an engine air intake, or within 3 feet of a tank's engine deck grills, had a better than 60% chance of introducing sufficient compound to produce engine degradation within the first hour of operation. A canister landing directly on a vehicle's upper surface increased that probability to over 80%. An aircraft releasing a standard load of 60 canisters in a stick across a target area of 400 by 200 meters a realistic target size for a dispersed tank park, could expect, in optimum conditions, to achieve partial or full engine contamination in perhaps a third of the vehicles present. This was, by any measure, not a decisive strike. But the cumulative effect of repeated treatments, combined with the diagnostic confusion such failures caused at workshop level, was something rather more significant than the raw numbers suggested. The German response, when it came, was revealing in its own right. By mid-1943, workshop reports from both the North African Theatre and the Eastern Front were noting an unusual pattern: clusters of engine failures occurring in vehicles that had been correctly maintained and that showed no obvious evidence of battle damage or mechanical wear. German engineers, initially baffled, began systematic chemical analysis of oil samples from affected vehicles. The process was painstaking, German military chemistry was excellent, and the analysts were not unintelligent men. By late 1943, several workshop reports had correctly identified the presence of foreign polymer compounds in oil samples from affected vehicles. The process was painstaking, German military chemistry was excellent, and the analysts were not unintelligent men. By late 1943, several workshop reports had correctly identified the presence of foreign polymer compounds in oil samples from affected vehicles. A report produced by the Wehrmacht's Feldzeugmeister office in December 1943 noted with admirable precision that the compound appeared to be introduced from an external source and recommended enhanced vehicle security procedures, including the covering of engine deck grills with tarpaulins when vehicles were parked in forward areas. This response was, from the British perspective, both a setback and a validation. It confirmed that the weapon had been effective enough to attract serious German investigative attention. It also triggered a further round of development at Aylesbury, where Thomas and his team produced a revised formulation, designated Compound Series 4, that was more readily miscible with engine oil, less detectable by the analytical methods the Germans were now applying, and that produced its degradation effects more rapidly, but at a lower final viscosity, making the resulting failure mode look more like a contaminated oil batch than deliberate sabotage. The operational record of the engine gumming program across the whole of the war is difficult to quantify with precision, and official figures remain partially classified even now, but post-war analysis of German workshop records, particularly those captured largely intact when Allied forces overran several panzer maintenance depots in 1944 and 1945, allows some tentative reconstruction. Across all theatres in which the compound was deployed, historians have estimated that between 800 and 1,400 individual vehicle engines were directly affected by the gumming program. Of these, somewhere between 200 and 400 required engine replacement rather than simply flush and repair, consuming significant quantities of Maybach HL 120 or HL 230 replacement engines that were already in chronic short supply. The time lost to unscheduled maintenance across affected units is estimated at somewhere between 45,000 and 80,000 vehicle hours during which those vehicles could not be committed to operations. To put that in context, a single panzer division at full strength, operating continuously for 1 week of intense combat, typically accumulated between 15,000 and 20,000 vehicle hours of operational availability. The gumming program, in other words, consumed the rough equivalent of 2 to 4 full Panzer Division weeks of operational time, spread across multiple theatres and formations over 3 years. That is not a war-winning figure. It was never intended to be. But in a campaign like the Tunisian bridgehead, where German armoured forces were already operating at the edge of their logistical envelope, and where every operational day mattered, even a 10% degradation in available armoured strength at a critical moment could influence the course of a local engagement. The British were not trying to win the war with engine gumming compound. They were trying to add friction, the military theorists' term for the accumulated resistance that slows and degrades military operations, to an already friction-laden system. The Americans, when they became aware of the program through the intelligence-sharing mechanisms established after Pearl Harbor, were initially skeptical. The Office of Strategic Services conducted its own evaluation in early 1943 and concluded that the compound was of limited operational value given the difficulties of precise delivery and the relatively modest rate of vehicle incapacitation achieved. This assessment was not entirely wrong, but it missed something that the British analysts understood rather better, that the value of the weapon lay not solely in the vehicles it damaged, but in the uncertainty it introduced. German armored units that began experiencing clusters of unexplained engine failures did not know whether they were dealing with a contaminated oil batch, a manufacturing defect, ordinary mechanical wear accelerated by hard use, or deliberate enemy action. That uncertainty itself had operational consequences. It prompted additional inspections, additional maintenance checks, additional security measures, all of which consumed time and attention that would otherwise have been directed at fighting. The Soviets, characteristically, developed their own variant of the concept through entirely independent research, deploying what NKVD technical files refer to as kinematic degradation compounds against German vehicle parks during the Kursk campaign of July 1943. The Soviet formulation was chemically cruder than the British version. It relied more heavily on abrasive particles than polymer compounds, but it was produced in considerably larger quantities and delivered by partisan teams operating behind German lines with a ruthlessness and effectiveness that the SOE's more cautious approach could not match in the Russian context. Post-war Soviet military histories credit the partisan sabotage campaign around Kursk with removing between 150 and 200 German vehicles from effective service in the week before the offensive began, a figure that, if accurate, represents a not inconsiderable contribution to the ultimate failure of Operation Citadel. The broader question of what the engine gumming program represents in the history of unconventional warfare is one that military historians have approached with varying degrees of enthusiasm. It fits awkwardly into conventional narratives. It is not the stuff of heroic action or dramatic sacrifice. It does not generate the kind of archive footage or personal testimony that documentary makers prefer. Its effects were statistical rather than spectacular, cumulative rather than decisive, and its very success depended on remaining invisible, on producing effects that looked like ordinary mechanical failure rather than enemy action. A weapon designed to hide itself is, almost by definition, a weapon that will be hidden by history. And yet there is something in the engine gumming program that repays careful attention, because it represents a particular kind of strategic thinking that is genuinely rare in military history. The willingness to pursue unglamorous, incremental effects rather than dramatic, decisive ones. The British experience of the Second World War produced, in several domains, exactly this kind of thinking. A pragmatic focus on degrading enemy capability through friction, disruption, and accumulated disadvantage rather than through single decisive strokes. The engine gumming program sits alongside the bomber offensive's systematic targeting of German transportation infrastructure, the Royal Navy's anti-submarine campaign's patient statistical war of attrition, and the deception operations that consumed enormous German staff effort in planning against threats that did not exist. None of these were individually decisive. Collectively, they represented a coherent strategic approach to wearing down an adversary with superior continental resources by attacking the connective tissue of his military machine rather than its armored fist. The physical legacy of the program is understandably sparse. No canister is known to survive in museum collections. They were expendable items, designed to be destroyed on impact, and their wartime production numbers were never large enough to make them common finds. The laboratory notebooks of Dr. Glyn Thomas are held in the Public Record Office at Kew under classification references that were only fully declassified in 1996, and they are remarkable documents, dense with chemical formulae, test result tables, and the occasional dry marginal note that speaks to a man who understood the strange position he occupied, producing weapons from a laboratory with the same careful attention to detail that a peacetime chemist might bring to developing a new industrial lubricant. Thomas survived the war, returned to Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and spent the remainder of his career working on lubricant formulations for jet engines, a transition that his wartime work had, in a sense, uniquely equipped him for. He gave no interviews about his SOE work and is not known to have discussed it publicly. His obituary, published in a petroleum industry trade journal in 1971, made no mention of it. Flight Lieutenant Marcus Webb, whose proposal for aerial canister delivery had made the program operationally practical, was killed in January 1944 when the Mosquito he was flying on an evaluation mission over the Dutch coast was intercepted by a Focke-Wulf 190. He was 27 years old. His contribution to the engine gumming program is acknowledged in a single line of a SOE internal review document produced in 1945, which describes his delivery concept as operationally sound and practically effective. It is, in the particular vocabulary of wartime British official documents, high praise. The German workshop reports that documented the program's effects, and that provide, paradoxically, some of the best evidence for its success, are held at the Bundesarchiv Militär Archive in Freiburg, where they have attracted the attention of a small number of military technology historians, but remain largely unexamined by the wider academic community. They make for interesting reading. The German Army's maintenance and repair apparatus was, by any measure, a formidable organization, and the reports reflect its systematic, methodical approach to diagnosis. The engineers who wrote them were attempting, in good faith, to understand a phenomenon they had not previously encountered, and for which their training had not prepared them. They got closer to the truth than their British counterparts expected or wished. In one report dated March 1944, a chief technical officer of the 3rd Panzer Division wrote, with what reads as genuine professional admiration, that whoever had produced the contaminating agent had demonstrated an unusually refined understanding of lubrication chemistry. He was not wrong. What remains unknown, and may never be fully recovered from the historical record, is the precise operational moment, if any, at which the engine gumming program made a measurable difference to the outcome of a specific engagement. The nature of the weapon militates against this kind of precision. It did not destroy tanks in visible, photographable ways. It did not produce dramatic after-action reports, noting that a key position was held because the enemy's armor failed to appear. It worked at the margins, in the gap between what German armored units could do and what they actually did, and that gap is filled in the historical record with competing explanations and incomplete data. The honest answer is that the program's precise contribution to Allied victory is genuinely uncertain, and will probably remain so. What is certain is that it existed, that it represented genuine scientific ingenuity applied to a novel strategic problem, that it was produced and deployed at remarkably low cost. The entire program, from laboratory development through production and delivery, consumed a small fraction of the resources devoted to a single conventional bombing raid of comparable notional effect on German armored capability. And that it reflected a cast of mind, patient, analytical, willing to pursue indirect effects through unconventional means, that characterized the best of British military innovation during a war that, at its darkest, demanded exactly that kind of thinking. The tank formations that drove across the Tunisian plateau in the winter of 1943 and across the steppes of Russia, and eventually across the plains of northern France, were formidable machines, tended by skilled men, supplied by an enormous logistical apparatus of remarkable efficiency. That apparatus had vulnerabilities. In a converted laboratory outside Aylesbury, a quiet Welsh chemist and his colleagues found one of them. They produced, in their careful, methodical way, a small container of polymer compounds designed to exploit it, and in the darkness over a dispersed tank park, A Mosquito without markings released 60 of those containers into a cold night sky and turned away north, and was gone before anyone thought to look up. The engines froze. The tanks did not move. And somewhere in the gap between what the Wehrmacht planned and what it was able to execute, the balance shifted, imperceptibly but irrevocably, in ways that no single reconnaissance photograph could ever quite capture.